Assalamualaikum warahmatullah and good day to everyone. Welcome to this pre-recorded session on MFRS 10 and MFRS 12 as a closure to our discussion on consolidation topic. In this session, we will be looking at two parts of MFRS 10, specifically revisiting the entity that are not required to present its CFS and an entity that are not required to consolidate. And then we will discuss the disclosure required by a parent in relation to entities that it has interests in, that will be under MFRS 12. Let's now start with MFRS 10. Under MFRS 10 consolidation, we know that not all parent entities with subsidiaries are required to present CFS. This is stipulated in paragraph 4A of the standard. The first condition is when the entity itself is a subsidiary, that is, either itself being 100% controlled or partially controlled by another entity, with the condition that if it is not wholly owned, thus have non-controlling interest investors, that group of investors must first give the consent for the entity not to present its CFS. This will require that the ultimate parent to present CFS for the entity and its subsidiaries either directly or indirectly. The second situation is when the entity does not trade its debts or equity instruments in public market, or number 3, the third situation, it did not file to do so. In both situations, an entity is not required to present its consolidated financial statements as it is not obligated to do so to the public. And finally, an entity is not required to present CFS if its intermediate or ultimate parent is required to produce the CFS which will be available to the public. This exemption comes as a relief to most of companies as not every company that is parent need to prepare CFS, as we know that the process of consolidation is very demanding and very time consuming. Thus it will not be reasonable to insist on every parent in, for example, a vertical structure to prepare CFS. And then we have another entity that is not even required to consolidate, because by consolidating, it will mislead the public as it will not be part of expansions of that entity as with any business combination would. And that entity is investment entity. Now, as the term implies, we can imagine an investment entity's main operation will be investing in other entities for the main purpose of wanting returns from that entity, or for capital appreciation, where when the time is right, it will dispose of its investment to secure profits from it, either for itself or for other investors whose funds it manages. In paragraph 37 of MFRS 10, it explains that due to the nature of investment entity, as we mentioned earlier, a typical investment entity will obtain funds from investors for the purpose of its investment activities. It commits to its business purpose of investing solely for returns from capital appreciations or investment income like interest or dividends, or it measures and evaluates its investments on a fair value basis. These are the nature of an investment entity. And the second part of the definition simply denotes that the entity has no other intentions like to strategically involve in the subsidiaries' relevant activities like a real investor would. Paragraph 28 of MFRS 10 lists down typical characteristics of an investment entity. The first one being having more than one investment, which is obvious characteristic since that is in fact the main activity of the entity. Plus it would be for the intention to diversify its risks and maximize returns. An investment entity can always hold only one investment at one time and still be classified as investment entity. This is true for situation where the entity is still in its startup period, or has not made other investments as at that date, or it has a pool of investors' fund to invest in a single investment which is not possible to be obtained by a single investor, or itself is in a process of liquidation. Thus it has perhaps disposed of other investments. The second characteristic is having more than one investor, and this is typical for an investment company as its clients will be investors with funds, and the company manages the funds to increase the wealth of its clients other than itself making profit out of these investments. And as mentioned before, it could be a pool of investors for an investment that is not obtainable to individual investor. And again, even if an entity has only one investor, it can still be classified as an investment entity for situation where it is still in its initial stage and has not identified suitable investors, or it could also be at the end stage of its operation where it has closed all other clients' accounts, leaving only one last client to be served. The third characteristic is having investors that are not related parties, which refers to MFRS 124 for related parties definitions, like its subsidiaries, associates, or its key management personnel. This is to ensure that the entity has no other interest or no other intention other than to earn benefit in terms of capital appreciations or investment returns, or both. And again, there will be situations where even if the investor is related party to the entity, it can still be classified as investment entity. If, for example, one of related parties of an entity is its key management personnel. So if these key management personnel pool together funds for investment that mirrors the investment fund of the entity's main investment, the entity is still qualified as an investment entity. So the key here is that the investment for the key investment personnel or the related party of the investment entity must mirror the normal funds or the normal investment of the entity's main investment activities. So that will ensure that the entity still will be qualified as an investment entity. And finally, the entity's ownership interest in the form of equity or similar interest like partnership interest. However, the standard also explains that if an entity has interest in instruments that are not meeting the definitions of equity, it may still qualify provided that as debt holder, it is exposed to variable returns from changes in the fair value of the entity's net assets. So the keyword here is variable returns, which actually mirrors the risk and returns from equity instruments. Further evidence of an entity being an investment entity is the way it represents itself. If it represents itself to others, mainly to potential investors, as an entity that provides medium-term investment for capital appreciation, meaning the investment is not meant to be a long-term arrangement since it wants to focus on the return from the investment made, then it will be qualified as investment entity. As opposed to an entity representing itself as an investor that will jointly develop, produce, or market products with its investees, which in this situation, it definitely wants to be involved in the main operations of the other entity. As stated in paragraph 31, in general, an investment entity shall not consolidate with its subsidiaries. However, if the investment entity has control over another entity that is not an investment entity and whose main purpose and activities are to provide investment-related services to the investment entity, it shall still consolidate. That means the investment entity owns another entity not for its returns or capital appreciation, but for its investment-related services provided by the entity. So this way, the investment entity is actually involved or interested in the main operations or relevant activities of the other entity, which defines the main purpose of an investment entity discussed earlier in paragraph 27. However, if the subsidiary that provides investment-related services to the investment entity also itself an investment entity, it shall not consolidate. Thus, it must be reported at fair value through P&L. Typical investment-related activities may include advisory services for strategic investment purposes, management of investments, administration services, and investment support like financial support such as loan, capital commitment, or guarantee to the investment entity or the investee. And finally, if the investment entity is owned by another entity, the parent entity must consolidate not only with the investment entity but also those entities controlled through the investment entity. So there you have it. These are the two entities that either not required to present CFS or not required to consolidate under MFRS 10. Let us now move on to MFRS 12. Basically, this standard guides on what shall an entity disclose in terms of its interests in other entities. The purpose being to enable users of its financial statements to evaluate few things: the nature, the risk, and the effects of those interests, and for the effects, it must disclose the effects in the entity's financial position, financial performance, as well as its cash flows. And this applies to interests in all interests that we have discussed earlier in this course, including subsidiaries, joint arrangements, interest in associate, as well as those unconsolidated structured entities. An important part of the disclosure is actually about judgment and assumption. An entity shall disclose information about significant judgments and assumptions it has made and changes to those judgments and assumptions in determining that it has control of another entity, that is, an investee as described in paragraph 5 and 6 of MFRS 10, since there will be a situation where an entity has no control even when it holds more than 50% shares in the other entity, or an entity having control even when it holds less than 50% shares in the other entity. It also needs to disclose the judgment and assumption used in determining that it has joint control of an arrangement or significant influence over another entity, since, similar with control, an entity could still have significant influence even without the holding of 20% or more shares in the other entity. And finally, to disclose judgment and assumptions in determining the type of joint arrangements, that is, either joint operations or joint venture, when the arrangement has been structured through a separate vehicle. For entities that have control over other entities but are not required to consolidate with its subsidiaries, so that would be investment entity, it needs to disclose its judgment and assumptions in determining that itself is an investment entity as per paragraph 27 of MFRS 10, especially when it still considers itself as an investment entity even without the characteristics of an investment entity as stipulated in paragraph 28 of MFRS 10. Let us now have a quick look at the disclosure requirements of those other entities that an entity has interests in, bearing in mind mainly what the standard requires is the disclosure on their nature, risk, and effects. For subsidiaries, we must make sure that the information disclosed enable users to understand two major things. The first being the compositions of the group, who is what, and secondly being the interests of other investors of NCI have in the group activities and cash flows. So this will include the name of the subsidiary, the principal place of business of the subsidiary, the proportions of ownership interest held by NCI, the profit or loss allocated to NCI of the subsidiary during the reporting period, accumulated NCI of the subsidiary at the end of the reporting period, and summarized financial information about the subsidiary, such as dividend paid to NCI and asset, liabilities, profits and loss, and cash flows related to NCI to show NCI's interest in them. Some of this information are already presented in the financial statements, but the disclosure will extract and highlight them even further. Also, information disclosed must enable users to evaluate four things. First, the nature and extent of significant restrictions on its ability to access or use assets and settle liabilities of the group. either legal restrictions to use assets or settle liabilities, or to transfer cash or other assets to subsidiaries, or distributions of dividends, or restriction in relation to the protective rights of NCI, and thus the carrying amounts of assets and liabilities to which those restrictions apply. Second, the nature of and changes in the risks associated with its interest in consolidated structured entities, such as the terms of contractual arrangements that require parents to provide financial support, especially if the supported entity actually reporting losses. Or if there is no contractual arrangements for the entity to provide financial support, but it still provides the support or have the intention to do so, it must disclose information about the financial support, including the type and amount of support as well as the reason of its providing the support even without having the obligation to do so. Third, the consequences of changes in its ownership interest in a subsidiary that do not result in the loss of control. Thus, basically, we are looking at the changes on the equity attributable to owners without the loss of control. And fourth, the consequences of losing control of a subsidiary during the reporting period, where an entity needs to disclose the results of the event, either gain or loss, and the portions of that gain or loss attributable to measuring any investment retained in the former subsidiary at its fair value at the date when control is lost, and the line items in profit or loss in which the gain or loss is recognized if not presented separately. You may refer to the specific paragraph of each item of concern shown here. To show you an example, I share here an illustrative example of a disclosure of make-believe company by KPMG in its guideline to apply IFRS 12. Here we have the information on the compositions of the subsidiaries. And then we have the explanations on judgment and assumption in determining the control over one of the subsidiaries, even with less than 50% shareholding. And also information in relation to financial support provided by the group to one of the subsidiaries, which users may use to evaluate risks taken by the entity. And here we have information about NCI and its interests, as well as the effects of NCI interest on the assets and results of subsidiaries, including distributions of income in terms of dividends. For unconsolidated subsidiaries, specifically, we are talking about investment entity that is not required to consolidate with its subsidiaries. They are required to disclose information such as name, principal place of business, and the ownership interest held in those subsidiaries, pretty much the same thing as disclosed by a parent about the subsidiaries. And that includes the nature and the restrictions to transfer funds, repay loans, or distribute dividends, as well as information about the current commitment it has in terms of providing financial support or its intention to do so. And that includes the nature and the restrictions to transfer funds, repay loans, or distribute dividends, as well as information about the current commitment it has in terms of providing financial support or its intention to do so. And if it has a contractual arrangement to provide financial support, terms within the agreement should be disclosed. This is again to enable users to evaluate risk in relation to the financial decision made for the unconsolidated subsidiaries. The same is required for decision made to provide financial support to other entities that it or its subsidiaries has no control over and might result in them controlling that other entities. For interest in joint arrangements, either joint venture or joint operation, an associate, an entity has to provide similar information such as the nature of its interest and financial effects of the interest and the nature of and change in the risks associated with those interests. To illustrate, again, I share here an illustrative example by KPMG. Here, we have the disclosure on its associates in terms of the nature of the interest, the principal place of business, and the information about the percentage interest in both associates of gold and silver. And here, it discloses the results of the entity's interest in the two associates, including distributions of dividends, eliminations of unrealized profits, and information about restrictions on the distributions of dividends until certain level of interest cover is achieved for a bank loan of one of its associates. The information about their results, assets, and liabilities are disclosed in full and not according to proportions of entities' interests in them. Appendix B12 lists down the specific disclosure for material associates, thus immaterial associates should be disclosed separately. Similarly here, for a joint venture, that is one of joint arrangements types, the entity discloses the nature of the relationship and information about the percentage interest, the results from the joint venture including its net assets for material joint venture, and the potential risk to investors where the entity agreed to covers for losses made in the future, which, however, is limited to €6,000 only. Here, we have information in relation to a joint operation including an agreement to take up all the output from the joint operation as a partner of the joint operation. This illustrative example also shown a disclosure results from an immaterial associate as required by paragraph 21C with details in paragraph B16. Finally, disclosures for unconsolidated structured entities. Now, a structured entity is an entity that has been designed so that voting or similar rights are not the dominant factor in deciding control over it. This means that there must be other arrangements on decisions of control. So for such entity, disclosure are required of relevant information to enable users to understand the nature and extent of its interest and to evaluate the nature of and change in the risks associated with that interest. So here, we have the nature of the relationship and interest, the results and risks in relation to the interest, as well as disclosure on the fact that the structured entity is not consolidated and the judgment used in achieving that decision. You may view the full discussion on the applications of IFRS 12 together with the illustrative example by KPMG in Putra Plus. I will attach that in Putra Plus. And you may further view the discussion about the disclosure in the appendix of the standards as well. I hope from this short presentation you would be able to understand the entities that are not required to present CFS, not required to consolidate their subsidiaries, as well as the requirements for disclosure of their interests in other entities. That is all from me on this topic. Thank you very much for tuning in, and I see you again in other discussion. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.